There's a specific feeling that a lot of people have somewhere in the first year of retirement, and almost nobody has a name for it. It's not depression exactly. It's not regret. It's a kind of quiet vacancy. Like you completed something enormous and arrived on the other side, and discovered that you don't quite know who arrives. Most people who feel this don't talk about it. Because it doesn't make sense on paper. You worked for this, you earned this, and now something feels fundamentally off. And you can't explain it without sounding ungrateful. Here's what this video is going to give you: the name for what's happening, the documented shape of how it moves, a real honest timeline for how long it lasts, and the specific things, backed by research, not by reassurance, that actually help it move. Because this experience has a structure, it has phases, it has known levers, and it has a real other side. That's not optimism, that's what the evidence actually shows. There's a sociologist named Robert Atchley who spent decades studying what actually happens to people psychologically when they retire. And what he found is that retirement doesn't arrive as a single event. It unfolds in phases, predictable, documented phases, and most people move through them without ever knowing they exist. The first phase is the one most people expect. It's sometimes called the honeymoon. The alarm clock goes silent. The obligations lift. There's a real sense of freedom, of relief, of space. For some people, it lasts a few weeks. For others, a year or more. It's real. And it's also temporary, because what comes next is the phase nobody warned you about. Researchers call it disenchantment. And it's not a dramatic collapse. It's quieter than that. It's the morning when the freedom starts to feel less like liberation and more like absence. It's the Tuesday when you realize there's nowhere you're supposed to be, and instead of relief, you feel something closer to unease. It's the slow accumulation of unstructured days that starts to feel less like rest and more like drift. Research on retirement transition consistently finds that roughly 4 in 10 new retirees describe a significant disruption to their sense of self in the first year. The number who feel it but don't have language for it is almost certainly higher. And after disenchantment, if you move through it, and the evidence is clear that most people do, comes a phase researchers call reorientation. This is where a new sense of self starts to take shape. New roles, new connections, a different answer to the question of who you are now. And beyond that, stability. A settled, grounded version of this next chapter. Here's the thing that matters most about this map. If you're somewhere in the disenchantment phase right now, that's not the destination, that's a phase. But understanding that it's a phase doesn't automatically move you through it. To understand that, you need to understand the mechanism. For 40 years, or 30, or 25, work was doing 4 things for you simultaneously. Most people never noticed because the 4 things were always just there. The first thing it was doing was giving you an identity. A sentence you could say when someone asked who you were. A role in the world with a clear name and a clear function. The second thing was structure, not just a schedule. A reason to wake up, a rhythm to the day, a shape to the week. The third was purpose. The sense that what you were doing mattered, that it connected to something larger than the day itself. And the fourth was social connection, not just friends, colleagues, teams, a community of people whose lives intersected with yours through the shared work. Retirement removes all 4 of those things at the same time. That's not a metaphor. That's what the research on post-retirement well-being consistently documents. A National Bureau of Economic Research study that tracked people across more than a decade found that complete retirement was associated with measurable declines in mental health over the average post-retirement period. Not because retirement is inherently damaging, but because when identity, structure, purpose, and social connection all disappear at once, the psychological weight is real. And here's what makes the disenchantment phase so persistent. Most people respond to that vacancy by staying busy, filling the calendar, taking on projects, traveling, watching, consuming. And those things can feel like movement, but they don't actually address what was lost. Staying busy addresses the structure problem. Partially, it does almost nothing for the identity problem. And the identity problem is the one that drives the quiet vacancy at the center of this. Because identity isn't rebuilt by occupation. It's rebuilt through belonging and contribution, and a deliberate answer to the question, who am I when I'm not defined by what I produce? Most people never ask that question explicitly. They wait for the answer to arrive on its own. And that's exactly why the disenchantment phase can last as long as it does. So let's talk about what actually moves the needle. Not what sounds reasonable. What the evidence specifically shows. There are 3 levers. And they're not what most people expect. The first is new social group memberships. Real ones, not acquaintances, not activities you do alongside other people. Groups that you genuinely identify with. Groups where there's a shared purpose, a shared belonging, a sense that you are a member of something. Research published in the journal Psychology and Aging tracked retirees across the transition and found something striking. The number of social group memberships a person developed after retiring was one of the strongest predictors of retirement satisfaction, subjective health, and quality of life. Not before, after. Which means this isn't about what you built during your working years. It's about what you build now. The second lever is contribution, not activity, not staying busy. Contribution. The distinction is specific. Purpose-driven roles that involve giving something to others. Not consuming, not enriching yourself, but contributing. Volunteering, mentoring, caring for something or someone that needs what you specifically have. The research on this is consistent. Purpose-driven contribution addresses the purpose vacuum and the identity vacuum simultaneously, in a way that purely personal enrichment activities do not. And the third lever is the one most people skip entirely, because it's the most uncomfortable. It's explicit identity work, not journaling for its own sake, not reflection as a hobby. The deliberate act of sitting down and answering a question that most people have never been asked to answer in 40 years of working. Who are you when you're not defined by what you do? Not who were you? Not who do you plan to become? Who are you? Right now, in this chapter, separate from your career, your title, your former role. A 7-year longitudinal study published in The Gerontologist found that retirees who deliberately developed a new self-concept, who did the explicit work of building an identity not anchored to their work history, showed significantly better psychological adjustment than those who primarily maintained their work-linked self-understanding. The goal isn't to find something that feels like work. The goal is to find out who you are when you're not performing for the role. And that's a question worth asking deliberately. Not waiting for the answer to arrive, asking it, on purpose, with structure. That's the exit from the disenchantment phase. Not time, not distraction. 3 specific levers: belonging, contribution, and an explicit answer to the identity question. The framework in this video gives you the map. If you want a structured process for walking it, one built specifically around these 3 levers, with exercises designed for each week of an 8-week identity rebuild, there's a workbook in the description that does exactly that. It's not a reading exercise. It's a working document, built to move you through this transition deliberately, not by waiting. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. Now let's talk honestly about the timeline, because this is where most content either gives false reassurance or stays deliberately vague. The disenchantment phase without active intervention typically begins somewhere between 6 and 18 months into retirement. Once it sets in, it can persist for another 6 to 24 months. That's not a small window. That's up to 2 years of genuine drift. Not because you're doing anything wrong, but because the identity mechanism doesn't resolve on its own without something deliberate to interrupt it. With active engagement on the 3 levers, real group membership, contribution-based purpose, and explicit identity work, research suggests meaningful improvement typically begins within 3 to 6 months. Not complete resolution, meaningful, measurable improvement. The difference between passive waiting and active navigation is real, it's documented, and it's significant. Now, the internal objection worth naming directly. If you're 2 years into this and still in the drift, the research does not suggest you've missed a window. The evidence on social group membership specifically found that it's the connections built after retirement, not before, that drive recovery, which means you're not behind. You're exactly where the intervention applies. There's also a version of this that people navigate more quietly. Not a dramatic crisis, not a clinical depression, just a persistent low-grade feeling that something is missing and a vague sense that the self that worked so hard to get here isn't quite available anymore. That version is just as real, and the 3 levers apply just as directly. The timeline is the same, the mechanism is the same, the exit is the same. What's different is only the urgency of the question. And for some people, the lower urgency is actually what makes it harder, because there's no crisis forcing a decision, just a quiet accumulation of days that feel like less than they should. If that description lands closer to where you are than anything dramatic, that's not a smaller version of this. That's the version most people are actually living. And it deserves the same deliberate attention. If the 3 levers in this video open something you want to go deeper on, the workbook in the description is structured to take you through each one, week by week, with specific exercises built for exactly this transition. Link in the description. Also in the pinned comment. When you think about your own retirement so far, which of the 4 things work was giving you do you feel the absence of most? Identity, structure, purpose, or connection? So here's what you actually have now. You have a name for the experience: disenchantment. And you know it's a documented phase, not a permanent condition. You understand the mechanism, why staying busy doesn't resolve it, why the identity question is the one that actually needs an answer. You have 3 specific levers: real belonging, contribution-based purpose, and the deliberate work of deciding who this person is when they're no longer defined by what they do. And you have an honest timeline. Not it gets better eventually, but a real window with real agency inside it. There's something worth saying about what this phase actually is. It isn't failure. It isn't ingratitude. It's the gap between who you were in the role and who you haven't fully met yet. Every person who has moved through this transition arrived at some point where they couldn't yet see the other side. The ones who found it weren't the ones who waited. They were the ones who asked the question deliberately, who am I now and how do I build that, and then started. The person who arrives at the other side of this isn't who you were before you retired. There's someone you haven't fully met yet. That's not a loss. That's what's waiting. One less thing to carry.